Hello friends, and today I want to talk to you about adding shadows to your characters, and a new feature that's been added to Tahoma2D that really helps with this. And I covered this and other features in a recent live stream that I host weekly, so do subscribe and hit that bell to be notified when I'm streaming next. And on these streams I draw, animate and answer your questions live, like this one, so do join me there, I'd love to see you. So today I'm using Tahoma2D, but most of these features work exactly the same way in OpenToonz. So here's Asher from a new cartoon being made on YouTube right now. And there's a crowdfund being set up for this, and I'll tell you more about that in the coming weeks. So stay tuned to hear about that. And I've mentioned shadows before in another video, and in that you'll find other tips. And you can find a link to that in the card above and in the description below. So there's three main ways to do shadows that I want to show you today. And the first one is to draw the shadow on the same level as your image. So to do that, select the colour you want to draw the shadow over, and then add a new palette entry, and in Tahoma2D you do that by clicking the plus button, and then simply make the colour darker by changing the value slider, or you can adjust it using the wheel. And then you can either use the brush tool to draw the edges of where the shadow should go, and then use the fill bucket to fill them in. Or on smart raster levels, you can choose the smart raster paint tool to just paint them in. And that gives you a real organic feel to the colouring. And this works great when you're colouring on the inside parts of a character, but as soon as you get near the edge of the character, like for instance if I'm colouring his hat here, it's really easy to go outside of the lines. And using the bucket fill tool that can't happen, but if your outside lines don't join up and there's some gaps and you have to use the paintbrush tool, this is a real possibility. Oh, and one thing about smart raster and vector levels is that you can adjust the colours after you've painted them. So you can simply select the shadow colour and adjust the colours live to make the shadow exactly the right shade. But drawing the shadows on the same level has some disadvantages. Mixing the colours and the shadows makes it more difficult to fix up errors, and it's just less flexible. So what I always do is I draw my shadows in another column. So again, if I had a smart raster level, and this will be automatically created in another column, and in this new level you can do as we did before. You can use the RGB colour picker to pick the exact colour that you're adding the shadow over, and then adjust it to be darker. And again, using the brush tool, we can simply draw where you want the shadows up to, then use the fill tool to fill them in, or using the paintbrush tool, again you can simply paint, but as you notice here, I'm painting over the lines because I'm on a different level. So let's just undo that. So to prevent that, ideally, you want your lines, your colour and your shadows on 3 separate levels. And we'll take a look at that next week. But in the meantime, the way I create shadows is I use a solid black colour and then draw the shadows where I believe they should be. Again, using the brush tool and then the fill bucket. And again for the other side. And then you can adjust the alpha slider of the black colour. And this allows you to see through to the colour underneath so you don't cover over the lines. And again, you can use the paintbrush tool on smart raster levels. And once you've drawn enough shadow on your actual image, you can then set the slider to where is most appropriate. But again, you've still got the issue of going outside the lines. So if you try and add a shadow down the side of his face for instance, you can see here it's easy to draw outside of the lines. But an alternative way to set the alpha isn't by adjusting the alpha on the palette entry, so if I move that back up to the very top, it's by adjusting the alpha on the column. So if you look on the column header here for shadows, there's this drop down in the timeline, and you get a similar one in the X sheet. And you can change the opacity here for the whole column. And if you decide to do it this way, you'll also need to tick a box in the scene settings, which you find in the scene menu, or in OpenToonz in the X-Sheet menu. And tick the box at the bottom here, enable column, colour filter and transparency for rendering. And that'll use the opacity that you set in the column header. And it's worth noting that you don't just have to use black as the shadow colour. You can also use other colours to add a hint of colour as though there's a light or reflective surface nearby. So for instance, if I change the colour to be a yellow colour, as though there's a light down the left hand side of the character, this will give a colour highlight to them. And it's quite a bright yellow, so as well as the column opacity, we could still change down the colour opacity, just to give a hint of colour. But as you may have noticed, it's really easy this way to go outside of the lines. So to prevent that, we can use one of the effects. And it's really easy to add. So if you just go to the effects room, or any room that has the effects schematic on it, and the schematic is this panel here. And this is the stage schematic currently being shown. And if we click the button at the bottom right, you'll see the FX button, which lets you know that you're in the FX schematic. And all you need to do is right click anywhere on the background and choose Add Effects. Go to the Matte and then Matte In. And there are at least 3 or 4 different effects that produce the outcome we want, but this one's the easiest to use. So you simply plug the shadows into the source by clicking on the blue triangle at the right hand side of the shadows node, drag it into the source red input and release, and then drag from the right hand side of the Asher node and plug it into the red matte input of the effect. And this will use the Asher drawing as the matte to decide exactly where to place the shadow. And then connect the effect up to the scene by clicking at the right hand side here and dragging to the scene. And we still want to see Asher, so we'll also connect Asher to the scene. So if we then hit the preview button at the top right of the viewer, we'll see that the shadows colour is only drawn where Asher is. So if I make this a little more obvious by selecting the shadows column and then using the Smart Raster Paint tool, if I colour quite a lot outside like that, when I hit the preview button, you'll see the colour is constrained to be inside the character. So you can use any of the 3 levels to draw shadows in this way using the brush tool and the bucket fill tool. Only the Smart Raster level can use the Smart Raster Paint tool, and all 3 levels can be used as the input for the drawing and the shadows column. But the third way to add shadows is to use a new feature in Tahoma2D, and that's using an autofill feature of the vector levels. So if I create a new vector level, and then as with the other 2 drawing level types, you can use the brush tool to draw a shape, which I'll do at the side for a second, and then use the fill bucket tool to fill it in. And this creates a solid dark area, but sometimes on a vector level you can't always fill it in, and that's because the shape isn't closed. But now you've got this auto close option, which means as you draw your shape, when you release your stylus, the end of the line will automatically close to the start of the line, so the bucket fill tool works more consistently. And you don't have to accurately close your shapes. But the killer feature that's really useful for doing shadows is the autofill option. And what that allows you to do is to draw a shape, to let the auto close the shape, and then it fills it with the same colour. And this is ideal for doing shadows. However, there's one problem that's not easy to see a solution for. And that is, if you change the alpha, either on the style editor or using the opacity of the column, you get to see this dark line. And the reason for that is quite simple, but a little bit strange. So if I zoom into one of these here, and then use the selection tool to select that shape, when you draw a shape on a vector level, this centre dotted line is the centre point of where you've drawn your line, and as your line gets thicker or thinner, which I can change by dragging the thickness slider here, the line gets thicker or thinner around that centre point. But at the same time, if you've filled the shape, the fill colour goes up to this centre point line. So that leaves this overlap where half the thickness of the line is in front of some of the fill colour. So with a colour that doesn't have 100% opacity, you get this double thickness of colour. And the simple way to fix it is to reduce the line width down to 0. So to draw a filled shape that doesn't have this line in the first place, simply set the minimum size of the brush to 0 and the maximum size to 0. And now, when we draw a shape and it fills without having that outside line. So let's try it on Asher. Put the opacity back to 100. Then using the brush tool with auto close and auto fill set and the min and max at 0, let's zoom in and then we'll draw the line and it fills in 1. So if we bring down the opacity, you'll now see a single block of shadow colour. So in the same way, when you've got a colour with a low alpha and you've got the line thickness and the fill overlapping, you get a darker area. If you draw two areas that overlap that are using a lower alpha, you get a darker combined colour. So you need to make sure that blocks of shadow are drawn in one single shape, or at least be careful they don't overlap. So for instance on the ear here, if I draw a shape for the shadow and accidentally go outside of the line to the left here, and then I do the same on the left and then go over the line, you see a darker area where those two blocks of shapes overlap. However, as this is a vector level, you can use the control point editor here on the toolbar, select the shape and then adjust the control points so the two shapes no longer overlap. Or by holding on a point and pressing delete, you can delete some of the points. And again, because we've still got the effect set up on this column, you can draw outside of the character, and when you render the drawing or animation, the shadow will be placed over the character. So there we go, that's a few ways to add shadows. Have a play with these techniques and see which one works best for you. And next week I'll take a look at separating the lines and the fill colour, and also how to use Alpha Lock to paint only where you've already painted. So I'll see you next time for more animation for free with OpenToonz Tahoma and Darren T.